We strive to not only provide financing, but also technical assistance and training to our small business borrowers. Today, we also open up the webinar to members of both the White Plains and New Rochelle Business Improvement District. So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. In the upcoming hour or so, we will share everything with you need to know about before signing a lease or even looking for commercial space. We'll cover the different lease options, your rights and responsibilities, and even some tips and tricks on how to negotiate the most favorable terms for you as a tenant. We're very fortunate to have Kevin McCarthy with us today, an expert in the field of real estate, and he will lead you through the presentation in a few minutes. Let me just give you a bit of a bio on Kevin. He's a senior associate at CBRE's Westchester Fairfield office, serving the commercial real estate requirements of clients throughout Westchester and Fairfield counties. CBRE's global platform also allows Mr. McCarthy to offer cross-border real estate solutions to his clients by partnering with CBRE's offices around the globe. Prior to his career in commercial real estate, Mr. McCarthy worked at ESPN in media conglomerate distribution sales. Mr. McCarthy's community involvement keeps him connected as a lifelong resident of White Plains, New York, the Westchester County Association's Young Professional Organization. Thanks again, Kevin, for your time and willingness to share your expertise. I really appreciate it. Before we get started, let me just take a quick minute to walk you through the technology. I hope now, even though we don't have a large number of attendees, I'm going to mute everyone on the call for the duration of the webinar, just so that we can actually hear the presentation clearly. If you do have any questions, problems, or concerns, please use the chat or the question box that's going to show up on your GoToWebinar screen. And you can type in and send your questions straight to me. We can interrupt the presentation to answer your questions in different times. And at the end of the session, I'm going to take everyone off of mute so we can have an actual discussion and interaction through the phone lines. Also, to make the presentation a little more interactive for everyone, we will have poll questions throughout the presentation, and we'll ask you for your personal experiences. The answers to those questions are going to be completely anonymous, so we do encourage you to answer using the mouse and clicking the appropriate box. I'm also going to ask you to just bear with me a little bit. I'm trying to control the PowerPoints and the questions and all the other things at the same time, so I'm going to try, but I hope you're going to be patient if it doesn't work out the way I hope it will. With that, I think we've covered the basics. I hope you're going to enjoy the webinar, and you're going to be able to utilize all the information. I guess we're all set. Go ahead, Kevin.
Simone, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to everybody today and to try to cover all the different leasing ability that there is out there. Let me first say that it's a unique process to go through and to sign a lease depending on what type of business you're in. Many different types of leases are used, and in the real estate game, a landlord has a profession in which he is represented by many professionals, from a real estate broker to an appraiser, someone who is a legal counsel for the landlord, and a lot of the time a tenant or a prospective tenant has a very big challenge on their hands to identify a fair lease that's set up with their space. So with that being said, Simone, if we could dive into the presentation and go to the next slide. We're going to talk about 3 different types of leases today. And if it at all possible, we're going to go through also some polls through the process of the presentation, just to identify what a lot of you are maybe accustomed to. And feel free to write in any questions that you would like in the chat. The 3 main leases that are out there is a gross lease, a modified gross lease, and a triple net lease, which is also in the industry we refer to it as a NNN triple net. I'll dive into all 3 different types through this presentation. Many people in the calls in the past that we have done this are experiencing a modified gross lease or triple net lease. So we can go to the next slide. As far as a gross lease, where you typically see this is in a commercial office building. Some of you might be accountants or lawyers or just need a small office in a commercial building. Varies in size. It could be as small as 500 square feet and as much as 100,000 square feet. It's a lease that has the responsibility about 99% of everything in the lease in terms of what is covered in your rent, of your base rental rate. And just for the sake of using round numbers, when a landlord charges you a rent, they do so in a gross lease by allowing the tenant to use and benefit the space for its occupancy, which covers not only the lights and the plugs that are used to, whether it's getting up and down the elevator or the bathrooms to make sure they're in good working order, the HVAC systems, or maybe there's a day porter and some concierge or security. It covers everything in the lease so that you as the tenant are only responsible for that base rental rate. Typically in a gross lease, the only number that is required to be paid above and beyond the base rent is electricity costs. And as I said, the types of space that have a gross lease are typically in commercial office building. The typical term of those leases usually had been about 5 years as a minimum. And since the market has softened and the economy has worsened, it's become easier to get a 3-year lease transaction as a normal practice. But typically it's anywhere between 5, 7, and sometimes 10 years is what we see locally from a commercial gross office lease. In that lease, there's an option to renew, which is negotiated in terms of the exact details of that option. And what happens is when you sign your original gross lease, at the end, typically between 6 and 12 months at the end before that lease is set to expire, you as the tenant will have a right to use an option to renew, which usually it's a permanent option that is set at a fair market rate. So whatever the area has been getting in terms of its rent, as well as the concessions that are associated with that rent, are applied. In a gross lease, is there a free rent period? Typically, yes, there is a free rent period that you see that the landlord would apply as a benefit for the tenant. And we usually see the free rent applied in the beginning of the lease term. So, for example, if you sign a 5-year lease, a landlord might incentivize you to sign that lease and obtain somewhere between maybe 3 months or 4 months of free rent to start up that operation. And typically in this gross lease, the landlord is going to give you as the tenant that free rent after you complete any sort of improvements or construction. Or maybe the landlord's completing those the construction for you. What type of security deposit can one expect? Again, this probably is more on a deal-by-deal basis on what type of business you have. Also, what type of improvements are going into the deal. The landlord has a cost of doing business, which is he may have to pay his lawyers, he may have to pay a contractor to help out to improve the space. He certainly has to cover his any sort of brokerage commissions that would be due. And then also what type of free rent is he putting in, because that is some sort of a concession that comes out of his pocket. And then lastly, what type of credit do you as the tenant bring to the table? And I think on a case-by-case basis, the average deal in Westchester right now, and I'll just use as a basis, a tenant that's been in operation is not on that of a Fortune 500 company, but startup, you can see security deposits via high at 6 months, depending on how much capital and concession the landlord is putting into the deal. The responsibility for the build-out 90% of the time falls on to the landlord, especially in is so tight everywhere you look to incentivize the tenant to do a transaction. The landlord will provide the build-out. A tenant will hand him rent. It's a 5-year deal. The landlord has those upfront costs. The idea has some deeper pockets from his lending capability, money in and capital to the deal to base and recoup that money over the life of the lease.
We're actually doing a poll. Hold on. Here we go. So if you could all kind of just to this, whether or not you have a gross lease. I know with but maybe just take an average of your group and click whatever box.
And actually, Simone, even if they wanted to use it, we have it would help me rather than you don't have. We can connect the dots.
Right. Okay, I'm not getting chat. Maybe I can try and unmute you guys, see if you can tell us what kind of leases you have.
Well, I guess we can continue and revisit this.
Yeah. Good.
So we do not have a gross lease.
Well, that one no answer actually came from me. Just to share something. Hold on. Okay, yeah, let's keep going with the presentation.
Okay, you can move on to the next step of lease description, which I believe is the modified gross. This is a lease that you as a tenant would pay majority of the cost associated in the base rent, and the landlord would help with your operations. A lot of the taxes that the landlord would pay would be included in that base rent. There might be some areas of additional areas such as, say, cleaning or HVAC that in your certain business it makes sense that you take on those responsibilities, whether it's to either clean your space because perhaps you need some extra cleaning. You have HVAC needs for extended hours of operation, where maybe your lease hours, the landlord is able to give you operations from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., but weekend hours, and you have some business that you need to have cooling and heating. Those would be the modified gross lease would net out space. Typically, we'll say it's $1 per square foot, would be subtracted out of your base rent, and the cleaning contract that does the cleaning for your building would be paid directly by the tenant, and it would be contracted out by the tenant. What types of space have a modified gross lease? Typically, these spaces are going to be warehousing operations or flex space. You're going to see some of this in some office leasing will have this. It's usually not very typical, but they do occasionally happen with a modified gross lease. We don't see too many landlords giving this type of lease to a retailer such as a restaurant, but it is sometimes seen. In this case, the responsibility of the build-out still typically falls on the landlord's responsibility, except for when I put up that HVAC system. It might be the case where you're either going to be inheriting an old system that you're going to want to upgrade, or there's no system at all and you're making the purchase. And in that decision to make the purchase for the unit, you're also going to maintenance that unit, which would then fall outside the responsibility of the landlord and would fall onto the tenant to make sure that it's kept in good working order. We can go to the next slide, I think, Simone.
Okay. Actually on the phone with the group, and I guess they're all small retail operations.
Okay.
So, yes.
Well, that's great. We can probably then skip the survey set process. We can go right to the triple net.
I think so too.
Timing is everything.
Try that. Yeah.
Lease, which I guess most of you are familiar with, is in the case where the landlord is going to allow you to occupy and sign a lease at his property to use the space, but your responsibility as tenant is going to be for pretty much everything that involves the operation and maintenance of the building, including the taxes. And in this case, whether it's the landscaping or the maintenance contracts for any of the building mechanical systems would all fall under your responsibility. You're very much involved in the process of how the building is kept up, with all the cleaning, the condition of the roof, the condition of the building systems, because once you sign this lease, you inherit, and typically what a landlord will write in this lease is that you have to keep in good working order these mechanical systems, which sometimes can be quite the challenge. And once you do sign that, it's the responsibility and the costs can get up there pretty quickly. Most spaces with triple net leases are found in the retail world. We will see some of them in the commercial office and warehouse settings, but it's not typical. In the case of the build-out, typically this is done mostly by the tenant. The landlord does have, in some cases, especially when the market right now, for example, is as soft as it is, the responsibility can be shared, or there could be some sort of incentive for the landlord to say, upgrade that HVAC system so that when you move into that space and sign your lease, the HVAC system, which typically has a 20 to 25-year lifetime warranty, will be provided to you brand new. And so in year, say, 7, you don't have to worry about the HVAC system kicking out on you and having to take on the responsibility of all that repair or replacement. We can go to the next slide, I think, Simone.
Yeah, I guess we'll skip
so
that.
I think everybody said they have triple net leasing here.
I think mainly the group that's attending, they're still in the startup phase, and so none of them actually has a lease yet. They're still out looking for space, and so the webinar, I guess, is mainly meant to help them differentiate all the terms and give them advice on how to best negotiate their spaces.
Great. Okay. Well, one thing to note in the leasing, especially when you're going to a triple net lease, but it really is actually can be found very useful in all aspects, is when you go to the landlord and ask him what he's paying in taxes, and especially now, there's so much commercial inventory that is being reevaluated. A lot of the municipalities have on the tax rolls assets that have been in valued and appraised in 2005, 2007, 2008, when the market was good, and the municipalities are collecting taxes on these assets as if they were still valued at what they were a couple years ago. And I think as everybody would agree, the market, as soft as it is, has significantly depreciated. And because of that, the taxes should also be depreciated. So if you're signing a triple net lease, you will be inheriting those tax costs, which is a carrying cost every year. And a landlord has the ability to get a certiorari for his building to amend the taxes. So it's something that could directly help and benefit your use as a tenant. Also, when you're in that leasing process and the landlord has some operating costs and items that they're talking about passing along to you, you also have the ability to audit those and look over his previous operating history on how he runs the building. A couple leases I've done, they've allocated, I think, $1.75 for snow removal. It's $1.75 per square foot for snow removal annually, and it's an amazingly high cost. So little things like that you can find in a operating budget and question, because at the end of the day, you as tenant will be paying for those costs. So I think this slide is probably appropriate for those that are getting started with the real estate search. What resources are available to help me and evaluate my needs and look for space? How can the brokerage community help me? There's a lot of helpful tools out there, and one obviously is what I do in commercial real estate, and help tenants that are looking for space and evaluating the market, its conditions, the market's history, the different comparable deals that have been done that are tracked by the real estate community. The unique part about commercial real estate, in particular the brokerage aspect, is in local practice and pretty much all over the United States, the landlord is responsible to pay the brokerage commission to any tenant broker. Typically, the landlord will have his own professional real estate broker that he has hired to negotiate on his behalf. And in this transaction and in his, even as far down as his lending, and his pro forma for all of his real estate deals, there's a certain amount of money set aside to cover this fee. So the nice part is, for all of you tenants, you can get a broker to work with you, and it'll all be done so that you don't have to come out of pocket any money. In addition, that you should look for online, there's a lot of information as it relates to different spaces that are available. Sites like LoopNet have been useful. I will say that the information on them is typically, maybe they get it right half of the time in terms of what's available and the amount of money, the requested rent that's available. But there are tools like that that are out there to help you, in addition to the local municipalities that are looking to help perhaps with tax incentives to get you to move into certain areas that have been designated, whether it's by the local IDA or even by the state, that can help you with certain economic incentives. A big question that I get asked is, what is the difference between usable and rentable square footage? You can think of the term usable square footage, which typically is seen in triple net leasing, is the amount of area that you're actually going to use, the carpetable area. So if you're in a space such as a commercial office building, there's area such as the elevators, the common hallway, the common bathrooms, perhaps the area for the concierge in the atrium. That is area that is additional square footage that's called rentable square footage. So using round numbers, if you rent 1,000 square feet rentable, typically the usable portion of that 1,000 square feet is going to be somewhere around 800 usable square feet because of the additional, we call it a loss factor, which is getting into a little bit more detail than what we need to for today's call, but it's an additional percentage that covers the area that's common for the entire building to use and enjoy. In a triple net lease or a retail lease, you're not going to see a lot of rentable square footage. Occasionally, if you go into maybe perhaps a small strip mall where you're sharing some of the, perhaps a bathroom or perhaps some building maintenance or operating items, maybe a boiler, that is where you can occasionally see a slight difference. But it's interesting to note, especially on the office side, the difference between usable and rentable. Parking and why it's important. Parking, especially in the old communities here in Westchester and Fairfield County, all over really kind of southern New York, municipalities are very stringent on their zoning, which is directly tied to parking and its ability to service parking in and around the site, or the controlled area by the landlord, or the municipal parking lots that are going to be able to help you identify where your clients can park. This is going to approve, you're going to get approval for, say, if a building has been in place for years and years and years, and it in the past had been for the sake of argument, we'll call it a bank. Well, that's a use that, and it's not a retail location. It's an office for one of the local banks. That on the municipality's zoning is approved as a commercial location. If they're able to lose the bank and the landlord wants to rent it to someone else, and you have a hair salon that wants to come in, the parking for what would be retail could be very different than the zoning that's approved for the parking for what was the bank. And if you can sign your lease with the landlord and not realize what type of parking, what type of zoning you have, you could have just signed a lease where you can't even operate your main profession in that location. So that's why parking is important. That's why you need to be concerned about zoning, because municipalities are constantly changing, and a lot of what has happened in the economic downturn is that you're seeing a lot of municipalities, especially the larger cities, try to stay ahead of the curve and rezone property for more conventional, up-to-date uses. When you go into some communities that are more of a bedroom village or town, this is especially challenging that you need to pay attention to. Approved use should be in the lease as well. As I mentioned, you don't want to sign that lease and have the landlord tell you, your barbershop or salon is approved verbally. That should all be set in writing that you have an approved use. We go to the next slide.
We have another poll, but again, I'm not really sure if that's going to give us a lot of details. Maybe we'll just right on.
So signing the lease, who should review the lease before you sign it? Now keep in mind, as I said before, the landlord does this as a profession. This is his livelihood. He has a lawyer providing a document that is written for his benefit, in his mind, in his eyes, for his use. When you get that document, you have every right to question what is in there. And the terms should reflect the business terms that you discussed with that landlord, as well as some other business-like items that need to be reviewed, which should absolutely be reviewed not only by yourself but by an attorney before you look to sign that lease. I can't tell you how many times people are shocked at a lease that looks very unfavorable to them and they get very turned off by the process. But you have to keep in mind that this document was written by for the landlord. for his benefit. And you, as I said, every right to question that. What happens if there are delays in getting permits and licenses to open? How can I protect myself from paying rent for long periods when I am not open? Before you sign a lease, you're going to go over the timeline for construction. And in the case where the landlord is responsible for the construction, this is probably less of a concern because he has incentive to provide the work in order to get you in so that the space can be occupied and you can start paying rent. In the case where you are responsible for the construction, the landlord wants to see it done quickly, and there's usually a hard date that you need to meet. So before you sign that lease, you want to make sure that the permitting process in the local town or city that you're in, you want to find out how long that process is. And I can tell you right now, in the city of White Plains, the turnaround process for a permit is typically 3 weeks. If you deal with the Architectural Review Board to change a sign, you need 2 weeks. These are all things that your local broker should be able to tell you beforehand. If you're going to go down to Yonkers and try to do this as a permit, it's the absolute unknown where it could take 3 weeks, it could take 3 months for permitting. Each municipality has their respective challenges as it relates to permitting, but you're in a system that it does take a lot of time. When there are delays in getting permits and licenses to open, all you really need to be aware of is that you've allowed yourself during your negotiation period with the landlord, you told him before you sign the lease, I've talked with the city of, say, White Plains. They've told me it's going to take me 3 weeks to do a permit. The contractor that I've been talking with says he needs 6 weeks to do the construction that's needed for the job. So the 9 weeks that have been discussed with the landlord should be a part of your deal with him, that those you're not expecting to be responsible for payment on when you do sign, before you sign that lease. How can I protect myself from paying rent for long periods of time when I'm not open? Again, it's a negotiated point that you can approach the landlord and say, I expect to do my construction work over the next 2 months or over the next 3 months. I will start paying rent when I get the certificate of occupancy from the landlord or from the city and show that to the landlord. That's when my rent starts to kick in. That's a negotiating point that you should and can make. The role of the municipality in all of this, again, do your homework before you go into a location that either you're aware of the process or need to confirm the process, or a new municipality. You need to do your homework with the building department to understand exactly how long it takes. Talk to the local brokerage community. Talk to your broker about how long typically does the Village of Harrison need to pull a permit for a demolition or for a construction or for electrical or plumbing. All of this will go and factor in very much so to your overall timing and the cost that you are going to incur. I think we can go to the next slide.
Okay. I mean, we had another poll scheduled next, I guess, so we'll skip that again. But I just wanted to also say, from my experience in the past year with small businesses, this really is a big, big issue. We've seen so many people that get stuck in their leases and already paying rent for spaces that they can't use yet. So if you're still in negotiations, just really heed that advice and make sure you give yourself enough time and budget some extra time if you can to get everything up and running.
And where you can, try to get the landlord to be responsible for some of the work. You could tell him that a lot of the time the landlord does this for either the other portions of his building or another building he may own, and he can do it probably better and cheaper than you can. and sometimes it's worth it to at least ask in certain aspects. This part of the presentation is renewing a lease. When do I discuss renewing the lease with the landlord? Well, you could discuss that at any time. If you sign a 5-year lease and your business has been in there for 18 months and you guys are really doing well, feel free to approach them, especially now where business is so difficult, and very rarely are tenants going to be comfortable saying that they can extend their lease term. A lot of the time, they're going to landlord's going to not expect that to come their way from a tenant, but they would have no problem if you approach them, even though the conditions of the market are soft. It could play to your advantage that you wanted to extend your lease term, even if you've only been in space for a year and a half. You have every right to discuss that with them. Typically, when your lease is about to expire, you're going to have a notification in your lease that's going to say, I have to contact the landlord in order to use the option in my lease, typically anywhere from 6 months beforehand to 12 months before that lease expires. And if you miss that date, you're still able to negotiate with the landlord to stay. The only thing that you miss out on is that renewal option is a set. It's almost as if you have a set of rules to follow to stay for a new set of term. And that term, again, it's negotiated. It can be 3 years. It can be 5 years. It could be 10 years. Whatever it might be is already in the lease that you have already signed. A lot of the time in that lease and that renewal option, it's going to refer to as what is fair market value. Typically either 95% of fair market value or 100% of fair market value. The definition of fair market value kind of is what it sounds like. It is what is considered the fair price, not only just base rent, but all of the concessions or any of the improvement dollars that the landlord would be responsible for. That's fair market value. And it's typically determined not just from what the landlord says, but also the deals that are in the market or have been done recently. So if you guys can go back to that broker that you used when you signed that original lease and call up John Smith and say, hey, John, I wanted to renew at the option that I have in the lease. Can you do me a favor? My landlord's being a little bit difficult because he thinks the space is worth say $5,000 a month, and I only think it's worth $3,000 a month. Can you let me know what the last couple of deals that were done in the area to support your cause? That all comes into play with fair market value. And the landlord typically is going to have the higher rents that he's going to want to push, and you're obviously going to want to find the rents that are going to be more on the lower side to support your cause. How do I exercise my option? What if I don't have an option? Your option usually, as I said, those 6 months or 9 months or 12 months beforehand, you usually have to set in writing to the landlord that you're going to exercise your option to renew. And you have to do it before that drop-dead date of whatever the time before the lease expires is going to be. If you don't have an option, it's a terrible thing, but you need to negotiate the ability to renew. So you don't have the guarantee that the landlord has to enter into an agreement with you. It's going to be a negotiation for that extension of the lease term. The protection on a retail space for a renewal option is you spent the last, say, you signed a 10-year lease, and you've spent the last 10 years building up this business, and you might be a destination spot. And you have the greatest pizzeria in town, and the landlord knows that. They're going to use that to your disadvantage if you try to extend your lease term, but you don't have an option, because he knows that you can't move because everybody knows where you are, and there's no other location close by that you can relocate to, that's where you fall into the danger of not having a option, which plays into, do I get multiple renewal options? Yes, you can negotiate that right before you sign your original lease. So if you wanted to put in there, I need 2 or 3 different renewal options, that should be acceptable to the landlord. What is a lease amendment? So when you do use that option in the lease, you're going to tell the landlord, notify him that you're interested in staying longer term. You put in writing and you send it over to his attention the option to renew I'd like to use. He's, instead of trying to draw up a brand new lease agreement that's going to add many hours onto your review or your lawyer's review or both, the landlord's going to send you a short amendment to that lease, which usually is only a couple pages in length, that is going to inherit all of the other terms that were in the original master lease, and it's going to change very slightly the term of the dates in which you're going to be allowed to lease that space, as well as some of the business items such as what you're paying in rent, or if there's any free rent or change to the electricity or any of the other operating items that might be amended. We can go to the next slide. Terminating a lease. A lot of the time people want the flexibility to get out of a long-term contract, especially nowadays. If a tenant is asked to sign up for 10 years, a lot of them can't tell you what they're going to be doing in 12 months. So they want to have the flexibility to terminate. You can negotiate this right before you sign the lease during the negotiation period and put in there your ability to terminate at a certain point in time. Landlords hate termination options. And the reason for that is, again, if you sign that 10-year lease and the landlord is going to book your income or your lease revenue as income, the landlord's going to take your lease and say, well, listen, I've got John Smith for the next 10 years in this space. He's a good credit tenant, and I'd like to refinance my building. Can you please let me know how much money I can take out of it because I have this contract, this lease with this tenant. If you have a termination option in that lease, that 10-year deal that the John Smith tenant will only say, if we have a termination in the 5th year, the bank and the landlord really can only value that lease, that contract, not for 10 years, but only by 5 years. That's the only guaranteed monies that are going to be coming in. So termination options are very difficult to get, and there are certain penalties involved in order to use a termination option. Under what circumstances can I terminate the lease before its expiration? If you haven't negotiated a termination right, which usually, say again, in that 10-year deal that we've talked about that John Smith has, if you want and have successfully negotiated a termination option in the 5th year, you're going to have to probably provide notice, somewhere between 6 months and 12 months notice to the landlord in writing to use that termination option. And usually the landlord's going to require a payment penalty. Could be anywhere from a month's rent to 6 months' rent, depending on what type of improvements and infrastructure that landlord has made to you as the tenant that they've put into the deal. What are my rights and responsibilities? What will I lose? Your rights on the termination is that you have the ability to get out of that lease. Your responsibility is to notify the landlord should you use that lease. And typically what you lose, depending on if you terminate it or not, typically though is the penalty that we just talked about. The one point I did not make is under the circumstances, what circumstances can I terminate the lease before its expiration? If you do not have a termination option, and in some cases, we don't want to go through this, but the landlord does not live up to its responsibility in the contract of the lease. An example might be that it's the landlord's responsibility in the lease to provide quiet enjoyment, or the landlord's responsibility to provide access to the HVAC system, that it will service the building. And say in year 2 of your lease, the HVAC system breaks and the landlord refuses to replace it. That's a situation where the landlord is, if it's responsible for the HVAC system in the lease, they not providing that HVAC operation can be looked at as a default of the lease, and you might be able to get out of that lease commitment because you are not receiving benefit for the contract that you signed. The last point on this page is what happens if I have an opportunity to move to a better space? Well, if the space is with the landlord that you currently have, you can approach them to move to that better space. If that space is in another building and you're in that lease and you do not have a termination option, you are stuck. You do not have the ability to be in that lease for any more time, unfortunately. So it's one of those that you have to pick your space wisely before you get into it and sign that lease. We can go to that next slide.
Sure. Actually, I just have a quick question. So what happens in the worst case scenario and the business goes out of business? I mean, what are the legal consequences that they're going to face from their landlord if they, the business is failing, they need to get out?
Yes. Well, the landlord, if you were to default on the lease and you stop payment, depending on your security deposit, the landlord can go after the money that's in the security deposit, and they can also go after you for the other monies due under that lease. You can obviously go into file bankruptcy and seek protection that way, but it really all comes down to the entity that is signing the lease. So if you are personally signing the lease, the landlord can go after you personally. If you are signing a lease as a shell company that is going to be in use just for this business, the landlord would only be able to go after that company. Now, it's very tricky because a landlord that has done his homework will be able to know what type of entity he's receiving, because he's going to want an entity that has the most credit, so that he is not going to have to worry about trying to track someone down if they skip out on their lease commitment and lease responsibilities.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
The right to ask for as a tenant. So before you sign this lease in your negotiation period, it's always important at least to ask. You might not receive it, but at least to understand it. Do you have any ability to expand? Is the store next to you vacant? Or is their lease going to expire soon? Well, I want to be able to have the right to expand on that space. The right of first offer or the right of first refusal is typically what those are called. The right of first offer is that the landlord is going to offer it to you, and you have the ability to either take it or not take it. The right of refusal is the landlord has to not only offer it to you, but if someone else comes along and looks at that vacant space next to you, the landlord has to tell you, hey, I'm going to lease this space to this other company. Do you have any interest in it? And he has to do that throughout the remainder of the lease if you've negotiated that right of first refusal. So you all the time have to be able to refuse that space in order for the landlord to lease that to someone else. Subletting rights are something that's also very important. You want to know what type of ability you're going to have to sublease your space. You want to know if the landlord has the ability to deny your ability to sublease your space. You want to know if there's any competitive issues that will allow you to, will not allow you to sublease that space. So there could be some sort of non-compete clause if you, again, are that hair salon and next door to you is a pizzeria owned by the same landlord. He might have a condition in the lease where you're not allowed to sublease your space to a pizzeria because the next door neighboring pizzeria has a non-compete clause. Those are always things you need to look at and research before you sign a lease. What type of signage rights do you have? Do you have to have a certain color awning? Do you have to have a certain style of sign? Is the municipality going to allow you to have a sign? Is it going to give you a already predetermined size of that sign or type of sign? A lot of the more ahead of the curve thinking municipalities have all sorts of signage that needs to be reviewed and approved. So you could have all the visions of the world of putting in a 30-foot sign to draw your customers in. If you don't, if you still has a ordinance against those signs or a certain type of style, that's what you're going to have to use going forward. Do you have any roof rights? Do you have the ability to put a sign on your roof? Does the landlord have the ability to put other mechanical systems on your roof? Does it have the ability to use your roof as a cell phone antenna? All those things go into play with regard to your lease. You're going to want to know what can and cannot be done on your roof. Is there a relocation right? Does the landlord have the ability to move me? Sometimes this happens in cases where the landlord has a very large piece of property and you occupy a very small percentage of it. He might look to try and relocate you because if you're only a small tenant, for using round numbers again, if you're a 1,000-square-foot tenant in his 50,000-square-foot building, he's going to want the ability to relocate you if he finds a tenant of, say, 20,000 square feet and put him in a portion of your space. That's a typical move that a landlord will require for his lease. Something to keep in mind. You get the next slide, Simone?
Sure.
Lease commencement and the move-in process. So when everybody signs their lease and you try to get the construction done in the process before moving in, this isn't really going to take place a lot in the retail world, but for those of you that are opening up an office, FF&E is fixtures, furnitures, and equipment that you have the right to install cabling, all your phone systems and IT should be able to be moved into the space while the construction process is coming to a completion. So that maybe the last 2 or 3 weeks of the construction job, you should be able to move that equipment and furniture and fixtures in. And your rights as a tenant before moving into the spaces, the landlord just has to provide access to that. We can go to the next slide.
I think we're
done.
That's
it.
So thanks again, Kevin. So if anybody has questions now, I kind of try to send a little chat message around to everybody that you can either use your microphones on your computer if you have that ability, or you would have to dial in with your phone to actually be able to record. So I unmuted everything from the microphone, so we should be able to hear you if your microphones work.